Life is made up of experiences. Experiences shape our perspectives and allow us to pass along knowledge. In this podcast, I sit down with listeners like you and find out that no matter who you are, everyone has a story to tell. I'm Ethan Smith, and this is Life Experienced.
I would have never imagined I would have a PhD in chemistry, for one. But I guess I've never really had a clear direction on what direction I wanted to go. I think when I was little, I wanted to be a police officer. And then I realized that involved a lot of conflict. I don't like conflict.
So there's no conflict in the research lab?
Oh, there's a lot of conflict sometimes. You never know.
Our guest today is Tyler Farnsworth, a PhD chemist who recently began his career as a research scientist. I sat down with Tyler and asked how it felt to receive his PhD degree. You said earlier that you would have never seen yourself with a PhD in chemistry. So, what's that like?
It's pretty surreal, to be honest with you. I don't think it's actually set in that I have a PhD. I'm realizing the PhD comes with a lot of responsibility as well. People think you know things. I think it'll be a little bit more real once I actually get my degree in hand as a piece of paper. And so really long term, I think with my PhD, I don't want to stay on the bench the rest of my life, but I think I want to move into more of either management or communication-based science. So whether that's science policy or the business of science or something along those lines.
Tyler is the first in his family to not only receive a bachelor's degree, but also a PhD, which gives him quite a bit to be proud of. He also began his PhD program working for a brand new faculty member, an experience which proved both challenging and enlightening. We were talking about interesting experiences that you've had. One is that you were the first graduate student to graduate from your advisor's group. So tell us a little bit about how that was, that was like.
I definitely have a different perspective now than I did when I first started, because I came straight fresh out of my bachelor's of chemistry. It was a small school. I didn't have a lot of research opportunities, and because of that, I didn't really know what research was until I got to grad school. So starting out at UNC, I actually didn't know my advisor was there yet because he started in between me visiting and me starting. And I met him my first week at UNC. And he was studying graphene and 2D materials. And so when I found that out, I was like, hey, this is really cool. I want to talk to this guy. So I was one of 2 or 3 students to join his lab in our first year and really had a lot of hands-on experience in starting up a new lab. So I was on the cutting edge of new design projects for a material, working on brand new 2D materials and learning how to set up a lab to be able to function as a usable space for new lab members as well.
Things were going well for Tyler as he began graduate school, but just as he was preparing for his first major exam in the program, he encountered a sudden and unexpected challenge.
In my second year of grad school, I was gearing up for my preliminary oral examination for PhD candidacy, which decides if I get to stay in my PhD program or if I have to leave the program because I'm not cutting it. So leading up into that, I had just given a presentation to my group about some of my research, and then I went home to visit my now wife, Katie, down in South Carolina. During that visit, there was a moment where I experienced some chest pain and some shortness of breath, and I was like, it's nothing. And so I let it go over the weekend. It didn't get better, so when I went back to Chapel Hill, I decided to get it checked out at Campus Health.
A visit to Campus Health quickly turned into an experience he will likely never forget.
And so they did a lung x-ray. They thought it was just pneumonia or something like that. So it was February. It was cold outside. Well, I'm sitting in the waiting room, and all of a sudden things start getting a little frantic behind the desks. And the doctor comes back to me and is like, "Can you come into my office?" And I was like, "Sure." And she's like, "Well, we're going to put you in a wheelchair and give you oxygen right now because your lung has collapsed." And I was like, "Really? You can't see this because you can't see me, but I am a tall, skinny, white male, which apparently makes me more likely to experience a condition called spontaneous pneumothorax, which in layman's terms is called a collapsed lung." So she's like, "Oh, but there's nothing to worry about. We'll get you all situated." And I was like, "You're giving me oxygen and putting me in a wheelchair." So they wheel me over to the emergency department, and I have a chest tube. So they make an incision, only local anesthesia, in the operating room in the emergency department. And they make it as an incision about an inch long to stick this really quarter-inch outer diameter tube that's about 24 centimeters long up through my chest cavity. So what's happened is the lung is collapsed, meaning there's a hole in the lung. So when I try to take in breath, all of the air immediately escapes my lung. Kind of like if you tried to blow up a balloon. If you try to blow up a balloon that has a hole in it, you'll never actually blow up the balloon. And that's exactly what was happening with my lung. Well, unfortunately, having a chest tube inserted with only local anesthesia means that everything on the inside of your chest cavity still feels this tube rubbing on the inside of your very sensitive lung area. And they say it's one of the most painful experiences you can ever have, and I completely agree with that assessment. So anyhow, they get this chest tube put in, they take me up, and they admit me into the hospital. And they say, "Okay, well, if it heals in 2 days, you can go home." Well, in 2 days, it was still leaking, as they said. And so I had to undergo a surgery to get this lung repaired. And then I went back to my hospital bed, and I was there for an additional 7 days, so 9 days total. And then it still wasn't healing. So I went home with the chest tube still in and hanging out of me, and for another week.
And this is all while you're trying to prepare for your exam.
Yeah. And so my recovery period ended 6 weeks after I got home from the hospital, and my oral examination was scheduled for 1 week after the recovery time ended. So I used that recovery period to kind of prepare myself for this oral examination. My boss was like, "Hey, we can move this back if you want." I was like, "No, if I can prepare myself well enough, I know I've healed." And so I ended up taking my oral exam and passed it and was able to successfully complete the PhD candidacy exam, which was really nice.
As it turned out, Tyler's condition is quite common among his demographic. More common, in fact, than he had realized.
In 2011, when I was doing a research program at Georgetown University, I was playing soccer on the field and suddenly had a chest pain, and I really couldn't breathe all that well, so I stopped playing soccer and decided to walk back to the dorm that I was staying in. Well, as I was walking back to the dorm, I just didn't have the energy to keep walking, so I decided to lay down on the ground till I could get back, regain some energy. Well, I regained the energy and walked back, and the funny thing then, well, it's funny now, but there were some med students staying in the same hall, and they're like, "You know what? You fit the stereotype for this thing about a collapsed lung." Well, I was this 18 or 19-year-old kid who was like, "This can't happen to me. I'm healthy." And they're like, "This might be a collapsed lung." And the best part about this story is that the emergency room was directly across the parking lot from where I was staying. But I didn't go. I was like, "I'll be okay." Well, it healed in a couple of weeks' time. Well, I got a CT scan last year just to make sure that I would never have this happen again and that I could get cleared for like scuba diving or being okay hiking in tall elevations, because the pressure change can trigger a collapsed lung. Well, we did the CT scan, and it turns out that my left lung had indeed collapsed in 2011 and actually exhibited more scarring than my right lung did that had this major surgery.
Adversity can come from almost anywhere, whether you have an exam deadline approaching or you're just waking up on another Monday. Hopefully, Tyler's story of overcoming a health-related obstacle will inspire perseverance in situations you may be facing. I asked Tyler if he had any final words of advice for our listeners, and he had this to say.
Enjoy the relationships that you have. If you don't know someone, get to know them. Everyone has a story, a unique story, and it's worth getting to know it, to get to know people better and to love people well. That's something I try to do. Thank you, Ethan.
You're welcome. Tyler is no longer limited by his condition, which has already allowed him to enjoy the many hiking spots around his new home. If Tyler does find himself holding his breath waiting for more issues, at least he'll have plenty of lung capacity to do so. Life Experienced is hosted and produced by Ethan D. Smith and is primarily distributed via D Sound, a decentralized audio sharing platform built on the Steam blockchain. For more information, visit dsound.audio. The music in this podcast is composed by Lee Rosevere and used under Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 license. For more information, visit freemusicarchive.org. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you like the podcast, be sure to share it with others. If you have an interesting experience that you want to share, please let me know by tweeting at Ethan D. Smith or visiting ethandsmith.com. For those of you still listening, there is one more experience that Tyler savors each and every day that I thought was worth mentioning. Well, here's one. I know that you really like coffee, so if like, what's your how do you make your perfect cup of coffee?
Great question. I'm so glad you asked. Every morning, I get out my Chemex and I do a pour over, but it has to be locally roasted coffee and fresh. I use my Baratza Encore grinder with a burr grinder, which means that it grinds the beans very evenly. I set it to 21 for my Chemex. I do either a 16-to-1 or an 18-to-1 water to bean mass ratio to make sure that it depends, 16-to-1 or 18-to-1 mass ratio for the appropriate ratio for the water to coffee mass. And then once it's fresh, I have my water heated to 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And then I pre-wet the filter in the Chemex. I add the beans, and this is all using a balance. I have my Chemex sitting on top of a scale to make sure that I have the appropriate mass, and the scale is a built-in timer, which is nice. I then, if it's fresh beans, I add the water to it and wait for it to bloom, and it will bubble up as the CO2 is being released from the beans. The more bubbling you get, the fresher the beans are. I add twice the mass of the bean with the water. Allow it to bloom for 30 to 40 seconds. Once that's finished, I will add the water in concentric circles, very carefully pouring onto the bean, making sure that it's evenly wet to drip through. I will finish pouring by 3 minutes and 30 seconds. And that is whatever the amount of water I will add, whether it's a 16-to-1 or 18-to-1 ratio. And then it should be finished dripping through by 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Once that's finished, you swirl the Chemex around to mix all the flavors of the beans together, and there you have the perfect cup of coffee.
So for all of you who are out there using a drip coffee maker every morning, you're doing it wrong. There you go.